Good morning to everybody. Welcome to the next of our BCO events. My name is Mike Ayton, and I'm the chair of the East Anglia Committee. I'm delighted to have you all here again this morning. Thank you for joining us. Today, in a departure from our normal virtual tours, which we've been running very successfully over the last couple of months, and also all the various webinars on design and specification. Today we're turning our attention to the planning system, and we're going to review the recent changes in the use classes order, and also look at updates on permitted development rights, the PDR system, and what impact that might have on the office sector. So there have been some quite radical changes that have come through, which our speakers will tell you all about, so I won't spoil their pitch at all. Just before I introduce the speakers, a couple of housekeeping matters, or a couple of points on the BCO. Last month, the regional BCO awards events took place. They took place online. They were hosted by Rob Van Zyl, who's based up in Birmingham, and he's the chair of the regional Midlands and East Anglia judging panel. There was a strong list of contenders for each award, and they were drawn from properties right across the Midlands and East Anglia. And with my Cambridge hat on, I'm delighted to report that our region came out with two winners, and it's always nice to plug the success stories. Best commercial workplace went to 5060 Station Road in Cambridge, and that's part of the CB1 success story. And it's a building that everyone involved in Cambridge would certainly be familiar with. Over 150,000 square feet of quality space developed by Brookgate. The architects were Grimshaw, and I think testament to that success was that it was fully let on PC. The second award went to Best Corporate Workplace, which I always think is sort of one of the major awards in that sort of shopping list. And that went to the new British Sugar headquarters in Peterborough. So, not from one of the major regional centres necessarily. So fantastic that someone like Peterborough could get that sort of attention. The architects there were CPMG. That scheme was 50,000 feet. And I think the point to mention there is that in January, we will be looking to do a virtual tour of that building. So look out for that date, and we'll keep you posted. Today's webinar is the last one that we in East Anglia are running so far this year. And as I said, we'll then pick up again in January. But there are still a number of national events coming through. So keep an eye on those. The BCO are running a series of briefings which examine the impact of COVID-19 on office design. And the next one is on the 25th of November at 11 o'clock. These tend to specialise on particular areas, and the 25th November one is focusing on washroom design and operation. And then on a wider scale, in the first week in December, the BCO is launching or relaunching its mentoring programme. And there's a series of events for next-gen members that take place during that first week of December. So if there are next-gen guys and girls on the presentation this morning, if you're interested in being mentored, or for the more experienced senior people, if you'd like to be a mentor and be in a position to pass on your industry skills and your experience, then do have a look at the BCO website. There'll be quite a lot of information on that, or either give me a call or give your regional chairman a call. I think that mentoring thing is going to be really interesting over the next few months, and particularly with the sort of working from home and slightly remote circumstances that we're in at the moment. So I'd urge everyone to pay attention to that one. Right, so that was the BCO stuff. So back to this morning. I'm delighted that Mills Reeve, lawyers based in Cambridge, have agreed to present this morning. And I welcome Peter Seaborn, who's a partner, and Alex Round, a senior associate, both in the planning team at Mills Reeve. They're going to delve into the detail of the new changes to the new use classes order and update us on PDR, as I mentioned. I think, Peter, this will take probably 20, 25 minutes or so, so there'll be time for questions at the end. So do fire them in. You'll be able to put your questions in on the chat line that you'll see on your screen. And without further ado, over to Peter and Alex.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you for inviting us along today. As Mike says, we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so talking about the recent changes to the planning system, with a particular focus on their impacts on office accommodation. Just a little bit about us before we start. As Mike says, I'm Peter Seaborn. I head the planning team at Mills Reeve, and I'm joined by Alex Round, a senior associate in our team. And as a planning team, we have a particular specialism in strategic land and promoting large-scale development. Our team was shortlisted for Planning Team of the Year by Planning Magazine this year, and has been recognised last year for our work on the largest housing planning permission in the country, and that was our work on a permission towards the new settlement in Waterbeach, Cambridgeshire. So what is today's topic in a nutshell? Well, I think it's best to start from the Prime Minister and his view. He described the planning system, the current planning system, as outdated and ineffective. He likened it, the system, to a house which was designed and built back in the 1940s, and which over the years has been patched up and repaired, but come 2020 is no longer fit for habitation. And when you think about that, that's strong words in terms of a criticism of the current system. And you add to this COVID and its effects on society, and the government's aim of stimulating economic recovery. And it's perhaps unsurprising that we have seen change to the planning system. I think what has taken a number of us by surprise is really the scale of change, not only what is happening already, but what the government is proposing down the lines. So when you look at the changes that the government is proposing to the system, I've summarised them here in 3 sections. Firstly, changes that have already been made, and these are the focus on permitted development rights and changes to the use classes order. And this will be the main focus of our presentation, and we'll come on to explain these concepts and the consequences of them. But essentially, they allow some development to take place without you having to apply for planning permission. And that's either because the works are no longer considered to be development, or because deemed planning permission is granted. Just to give you a sort of feel for the scale of this, over the last year, we've had in the region of, I think my last count was about 8 pieces of legislation, statutes or statutory instruments, which for the planning regime is a real huge change. So regular changes in legislation. So that's what's happened now. The second and third limbs are looking ahead. So the government is proposing changes to the current planning system, and it's had a recent consultation on this. And its aims here, this is my second limb on the slide, is to improve the effectiveness of the current system in the short term, and that's pending wider reform. We then look on to the third limb, and these are proposals to make significant changes to the system. And these proposals are within the much publicised Planning for the Future White Paper, which has received a lot of press attention, not just in the planning regime, but more broadly nationally. And it's here that the government sets out its plans to undertake its fundamental reform of the system, which the Prime Minister has described as radical reform unlike anything we've seen since the Second World War. Again, that just gives an idea of the scale of what's being proposed. But changes to the planning system are never straightforward. And key parts of the government's existing changes are the subject of a legal challenge. And this is a challenge being brought by a campaign group called Rights Community Action. And they have challenged the changes to use classes and permitted development rights in the courts. And they're seeking for those statutory instruments which contained those key changes to be quashed. As I've said on the slide, the case was heard in the region of 4 weeks ago, and a judgment on this is still awaited. Certainly one to look out for in the press in the coming weeks. So now Alex is going to take us through the changes to the use classes order.
Thank you very much, Pete, and thank you very much to everybody else for having us this morning and inviting us to come and talk to you about these things. The use classes order has undergone some fairly fundamental change in the last few months, but just before going into that, it might be useful to just make a general contextual point, which is something that Pete's already alluded to, but is important for understanding what the use classes order actually does and why, therefore, that the changes to it are so fundamental. A fairly well-trodden idea in the planning world is that you need planning permission to carry out development. And in that context, the carrying out of development can include making a material change to the use of land or a building. And what the use classes order does, or the thing that it's most well known for doing, is putting different uses into categories, the use classes. And everyone will be familiar with the shorthand terms that are given to those classes that describe those sorts of uses. But the magic of the use classes order is that a change of use from one use to another that are both within the same use class does not constitute development and therefore does not require planning permission. And that's the context for why these changes are so significant. I've put it in bold and underlined it just to underscore the point, but this now means, following the changes, that lots of changes of use can now happen without planning permission needing to be applied for. And this, on the one hand, gives huge flexibility to landowners and business owners and developers and so on, and on the other hand, takes away quite a lot of control from local planning authorities. And just to get a sense of the difference in opinions on either side of the aisle, I've got some quotes from Planning Magazine, which reported mixed views on the effect of these changes. But a quote from the British Property Federation, on the one hand, said that they struck a good balance. They're radical without being reckless, and they provide welcome flexibility. Whereas somebody from the Planning Officers Society said that the consequences will be phenomenal. Just leaving the market to do what it wants is very unlikely to deliver the combination of uses that attract people to town centres. This will apparently decimate town centres. So there are strong views on either side of the aisle, but one thing is certain is that this is a new landscape for people in the industry to be operating within. Just before looking at the detail of what has actually changed, why is it happened? Well, the government has described this as being a response to a change in demand on the high street and in town centres, and is also billed as part of the response to the coronavirus pandemic. But despite the focus on the high street, the changes to the use classes order nonetheless apply across the entire country, and that includes, interestingly, out of town centres, for example, on larger office and retail parks. And while they are brought in as part of the package for dealing with the pandemic, there is nothing to suggest that the changes are temporary. And so, subject to outcome of the legal challenge that Pete mentioned, it does appear as if these changes are part of the new landscape, and that they are not going anywhere in a hurry. So depending on the quality of or perhaps the size of the screen that you're watching the webinar on, you might be able to see some of the information on this slide, which essentially is a summary of the changes. The first two columns will contain familiar looking things, and the final column perhaps less so. But here you've got well-established uses retail, cafes and restaurants, office, education, etc., with a note on what use class that previously fell within, and then in red in the final column the use class which those uses now fall within. And you can see, interestingly, that a lot of them have been grouped together into a new class E, which I'll come on to talk about in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But just summarising, in case the text is a bit too small for some, previously an A1 shop retail use is now within class E, as are A2 financial and professional services and A3 cafe and restaurant uses going into class E as well. Also B1, so office, and then R&D, light industrial process, all in together in class E, along with some other elements from previously D1 and D2. Also notable is that certain uses are now no longer in any use class at all. That's what the term sui generis means. And so these are uses that are effectively given protection from changes of use, i.e. if you wanted to change use away from a pub or a takeaway or a cinema or a concert or a bingo hall or a dance hall, those are the examples on those slides, you would on the face of it need planning permission to do that. But class E is, I think, arguably the most wide-reaching of the new classes and therefore the most interesting for our purposes. So I've put on this slide all the different uses that now fall within class E. And just going back to my preliminary point, it is now the case that planning permission will not be required in most cases for a change of use to any of the uses or part uses for anything in this list. And as I've mentioned, this is a consolidation of things that used to fall within different use classes. So we've got the familiar B1 type uses at the bottom there in EG. That's where you find the office use. But of course, you can see the leftovers from A1, A2, A3, and parts of D1 and D2 in there as well. So what are some of the implications of this moving forward? And I know a lot of local planning authorities will be wondering how it is that they can retain control over changes of use going forward, if at all. And there it's worth bearing in mind a distinction between planning permissions that already exist and planning permissions yet to be granted. Unless an existing planning permission contains a condition or perhaps has associated with it a Section 106 obligation, which specifically prevents changes of use to other uses or requires that a building is used for a specified use only, then that might still be an effective impediment to the use of the use classes order in terms of changes of use. But unless such a thing is already in place, on the face of it, there is now very little that a local planning authority can do to prevent a change of use within Class E, which of course provides huge flexibility to those looking to take the benefit of that and a lot of control away from the local planning authority. But local planning authorities will of course still be tasked with granting new planning permissions for development, and there may be the ability for planning authorities to impose new conditions that do seek to restrict essentially the use of the use classes order, the operation of the use classes order. And there may in certain circumstances be good planning reasons for requiring a building to only be used for a specified purpose, or put another way, not to be used for certain specified purposes. And you often do see this in the out of centre, out of town, larger office or retail parks, where the assessments that have underpinned the grant of planning permission for those larger developments depend on a level of certainty about the type of use and occupancy in those buildings. There may be scope for local planning authorities to impose conditions to prevent this from happening, but there need to be very good planning reasons for doing so, and great care always needs to be taken in the drafting of conditions which seek to do that. Another interesting consideration is what leases should now be saying about permitted uses. There will be existing leases that need to be interpreted, of course, but new leases will be granted. And what are they to say about what tenants can and can't do? And on both sides of the aisle, there could be a benefit to either tightening or loosening the permitted use, depending on your objective. So as a landlord, you may wish taking a holistic approach to wider estate management to very tightly control the permitted use of buildings for estate management purposes, and therefore will look to restrict the flexibility afforded by Class E in the drafting of permitted user clauses. Or it might be that you think that a higher rent can be commanded by giving a tenant greater flexibility, and so you might want to slacken it. And those points apply equally on the tenant side as well. And so context will be key. But this will be an area where real estate lawyers and other professionals will be looking closely at what the appropriate thing to do is in terms of restricting uses in leases, even if those restrictions don't exist in the planning world. I've got a bullet point there which just says interpreting existing permissions and dealing with existing applications. Very, very briefly, it should be fairly clear on the face of existing planning permissions what it is that they require and allow, even if the terminology is old. 1,000 square feet of B1 space is still interpretable now, even though that use is described as being within Class E. Existing applications that are submitted before but not determined by the time that these changes came in are to be determined with reference to the old terminology, and that simply means you don't have to submit another planning application just because of these changes. And there's a practical point that I've mentioned on here as well, which is that even if the change of use of a building might, in a planning sense, now be something that you are free to do, we've obviously got the point about, well, if you're a tenant, what does your lease say that you're allowed to do? But there are other practical considerations. So the conversion of a large building from one use to a very different use may itself require physical works to be undertaken to that building. And in some cases, those are works that will require planning permission for more substantial physical alterations. And so that's something that will need to be borne in mind. A couple of things to think about there, just in terms of taking the advantage of the flexibility. And then there are plenty of other questions out there which people in the industry are considering at the moment, and perhaps without there being any hard and fast answers to these yet to point to. But I think there's probably an argument that certain local plan policies, even recently adopted ones, might now be out of date as a result of these changes. The same might be said of national planning policy and the NPPF, particularly the retail planning policies. Perhaps still charging schedules could now be out of date. It will very much depend on what they say and how they say it in terms of the different rates that might apply to floor space in different uses. There's certainly a question mark there at least. And then also, how do we assess the environmental and retail and other impacts of larger development that come forward now, bearing in mind the flexible uses that might be available in future? It does pose additional question marks there as well. And the final bullet point here is a question about whether or not developers could use the use classes order and the opportunities for changing use that arise from the use classes order to create leverage in conversations with local planning authorities about other proposals which do still require planning permission. So the idea is, if you had a proposal that you might not think would have the support of the local planning authority in terms of applying for planning permission for it, there may now be other things that could be pointed to as alternative uses which are available now as a result of these changes, which also don't have the support of the local authority. And it will be interesting to see whether or not this sort of leverage in bargaining might be might be created in future. But I've heard a few commentators talking about this already. The proof will be in the pudding. And that is an opportunity for me to hand over to Pete to continue the discussion, but this time in relation to permitted development rights and changes to that regime.
Thanks, Alex. So permitted development rights, where do they fit into all of this? Well, as we've said, planning permission is typically required for the development of land, so be it a construction of a building or a material change of use. And planning permission may be granted by development order. And this is what the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order does. So in other words, rather than you having to submit a planning application to the local planning authority for planning permission, the order contains a list of categories of development for which you've automatically got deemed planning permission. Now, this is different to the use classes order. As Alex said, the use classes order sets out categories of material change of use which don't constitute development. Here, the development requires planning permission. It's just that there is deemed or automatic planning permission granted. Now, before coming on to the new changes, it's perhaps worth just reflecting on the previous permitted development rights relating to offices, which hit the news back in 2013. And these were the permitted development rights dealing with the conversion of certain office accommodation to residential. Now, I just flagged that because the whole purpose of that change was to increase the amount of residential development going on in the country. And these changes that I'm going to come on to largely followed the same theme of it's all about building more residential development quicker in order to achieve the government's objectives for housing delivery. So these changes were again badged as part of the government's economic response to the pandemic. But again, there have been ideas which the government have had for quite some time. So there's a bit more to them rather than just a pandemic response. So what are the new rights? Well, there's various categories of rights for residential development. As you'll see on the slide, some of them involve the demolition of buildings and the rebuild, reconstruction for residential. Others permit additional floors of residential above existing buildings. So you'll be able to see on that list, just pausing for a moment and looking through that, some I've badged as flats above flats, so building additional stories. Some are badged as upward extension, and then you'll see at the bottom demolition of blocks of buildings. So of particular interest here, perhaps are putting 2 additional stories of flat accommodation above detached or terraced office accommodation, or the demolition of office accommodation and in its place constructing a block of flats or a dwelling house. So on the face of it, it's quite a significant change here in terms of what deemed planning permission is granted for. And Alex talked you through some commentary on the use classes order, and it's fair to say that there has been criticism levelled by from some parts or in terms of the permitted development rights as well. Arguments go that they dilute control of local planning authorities. They potentially reduce public participation in the process if the principle of development has already been accepted. Avoids affordable housing, and then arguments about the quality of the accommodation going back to the 2013 change of use. There were examples that hit the mainstream media of office to resi accommodation changes where there was limited light and windows to the accommodation, and the floor areas of the accommodation in some instances were considered substandards to small rooms, which weren't in line with that which you'd have to demonstrate if you wanted to apply for planning permission to a planning authority. But when looking at permitted development rights, it's always important to read the small print. And I say that because there are a number of factors that need to be taken into account before the permitted development rights and the benefit of it actually apply. So the first one is the permitted development rights are subject to a number of limitations. And if you want to utilize a particular right, you've got to make sure it fits squarely within what you're planning fits squarely within the right. So for example, I flagged up just earlier class ZA, which was the demolition of an office use and the construction of a block of flats. Now, limitations on this where permitted development isn't allowed include where the old building was a listed building or it was within another type of protection, for example, a conservation area. If the old building was constructed from 1990 onwards, if the old building's footprint exceeded 1,000 square meters, or it was higher, the old building was higher than 18 meters. Others include the old building must have been vacant for at least 6 months, and the new building footprint must be within the old building footprint, and so on. There's a huge list of these requirements that need to be satisfied in order for the permitted development right to apply. Now, the second point to raise is, despite a planning application not needing to be made for permitted development rights, these permitted development rights require you to obtain prior approval of certain matters. Again, going to class ZA, this is the demolish office and build residential. Matters that need to be approved, just to give you some examples, include transport and highways impacts, contamination risk, flood risk, design, provision of natural light in all habitable rooms. That's been brought in to try and overcome the criticism that I mentioned earlier about windows and natural light. Amenity, noise, method of demolition, and so on. So again, a huge list of matters that need to be approved as part of a prior approval process. The third point to raise is that permitted development rights can be disapplied in a number of cases. Examples include if the existing use isn't itself lawful, that can be a problem. Local authorities can stop the use of certain permitted development rights by bringing forward what's known as an Article 4 direction, which limits the use of permitted development rights or some categories in certain areas. Permitted development rights can be removed by a condition on the existing planning permission relating to the building. So you'll see conditions on planning permissions which prohibit the use of permitted development rights. Also, in EIA development, development subject to environmental impact assessment, again, is limited and prohibited from benefiting from permitted development rights. A fourth point to raise is the most recent change of note to the permitted development system, which is due to come into effect in April next year, is the introduction of a requirement for new dwellings to be constructed under permitted development rights to comply with nationally described space standards. Again, going back to the 2013 permitted development rights, this is another change being brought in by the government to react to the criticism as to the quality of some of the accommodation that's been built following conversions of office to resi. So some other points to bear in mind. I've gone through the technical points, but there's also factors which Alex mentioned in relation to use classes, such as landlord's consent for works and change of use. Other points to bear in mind are practicalities. how easy is it to construct additional floors of flats above an office, both during the construction process and then once constructed, how's the operation of the two uses going to work side by side? Other points to bear in mind is that community infrastructure levy could still be chargeable despite the scheme coming forward under permitted development rights. So while the permitted development rights on the face of it seem significant, when seen in the context of these controls that's placed on them, it's perhaps dampened down slightly. And for that reason, I think the, as Alex said, the changes to the use classes order really is the most significant of these sets of changes from my perspective. But again, in the same way as Alex said, it may be that these permitted development rights are used as a fallback or as a bargaining tool, as an argument with the local planning authority. An argument to raise, it may be saying, well, that this is what I might be able to do under the permitted development regime. So what I'm actually planning to do is either not so significant or doesn't have additional effects. So it's for that reason, more than anything, it's a really interesting change to the system. Well, I hope you found that useful, and I think we've just about stuck to time. But Mike, you did promise the opportunity for a few questions.
Peter and Alex, yeah, thanks very much for that. It's a pretty technical and complex subject. Obviously, in half an hour or so, we can sort of scratch at the surface, but I think there's an awful lot of food for thought there. So many thanks to both of you for that. I think on just picking up on the PDR, I mean, it may be that Cambridge is not necessarily a market that has strong PDR, given the strength of the commercial sector, but there's quite a lot of people who will be in on the presentation who aren't necessarily just from the local area. But I guess one of the issues, and you did allude to it, is the sort of bad publicity that PDR has had from certain areas where there's been really substandard accommodation being created from the conversion. And you did say that the government are introducing standards, but are those standards sufficient? And then who's going to, is it then back down to the local authorities to try and impose those standards?
It's a good question, Mike. Well, firstly, the government has been criticised, as you've said, and they've sought to resolve it. So the two areas where they've sought to address this under the new PD rights is firstly, as I mentioned, the nationally described space standards. So this is ensuring that the size of habitable rooms is the same as it would be if you applied for planning permission for a house or a block of flats direct. So the government seeking to make sure that there is a comparison between the two. And the second is this requirement to have various details approved. So I mentioned design, amenity, and the amount of natural light. So these are matters which would have to be approved by the local planning authority. So in answer to your question, it does place part of the responsibility back in the local planning authority's hands. But under these new permitted development rights, they've got more tools to go about achieving that rather than was the case previously.
Well, I think it's just worth mentioning as well is that despite the fact that PD rights continue to attract criticism for these sorts of reasons, the current government does appear to quite like the use of PD rights as a tool for reforming the planning system and doing things a bit differently, and it thinks a bit more quickly and a bit more efficiently. And we've obviously not talked about the white paper in today's presentation, but if you were to read the white paper, which is the government's vision for the radical overhaul of the planning system that could come in the next few years or so, there's clearly a home for PD rights in that vision and the expectation that more development will take place under PD rights. So the government in my senses, will double down on the benefits of PD rights, and will do what it thinks it needs to do to get people on board with them.
I think that's a good point. Just one thing to add is often local authorities like to have development areas master planned. So you would have a plan identifying how development in a particular area is going to come forward. Now these changes don't take that into account. So it's not the case that you will end up with development which reflects what was proposed as part of strategic master planning. This is more sporadic development, which will potentially change the nature of how certain areas and their character are intended to come forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm just going back to use classes. Although it's relatively early days, are you guys seeing any evidence of substantial changes in the way leases are drafted? Again, you referred to it in the presentation that it could open up, or it could landlords could open up the approach, or they could tighten down. But in terms of real evidence, is anything coming through yet? I mean, we're in a market where there's not masses of activity going on, so maybe the volume of transactions is probably less than it would have been, say, 12 months ago. But there must be presumably must be something coming through already.
Yeah, that's a fair observation and a good question. The volume of transactions is down comparatively, but there is evidence that it's starting to whir back into life again. And Peter and I don't deal in the drafting of leases. We've got far more impressive real estate colleagues who take care of that. But in conversations with those colleagues, and just anecdotally, because we get questions about this quite a bit from colleagues, and there is evidence that people are very interested in this. We get quite a lot of questions about what user clauses in leases should say, and the bulk of queries that we're getting at the moment are about how to either disapply the flexibility of Class E or to restrict it. So there are some occasions where people are abandoning the use of referring to the use classes themselves, and are just using plain English to describe what is and what is not allowed. We certainly are not seeing much in the way of blanket Class E permitted use in leases. So the bulk of the work being undertaken at the moment does appear to be, how do we put it, what words do we need to use to put it back to how it was before the changes came in, or not even referring to use classes at all, in an attempt to keep things tight. There'll be some more adventurous proposals that come forward in future, I'm sure, where there are examples of great flexibility, and one wonders what one might have to pay for the benefit of doing so. But yeah, at the moment, the evidence appears to be that people are looking to restrict and tighten this.
That would be my feeling. I think if a landlord is just happy to say, yeah, you can do anything within E. I mean, your list of different uses within E is so large that landlords must want to be able to control that. Maybe even more than they've done so in the past, maybe.
Yeah, perhaps so. Although it's also interesting to note that there's reference to not only uses, but part uses. And I think just thinking about what that means in practice, but also how some businesses are now changing the way that they operate. For example, fewer bums on seats in offices, and certain uses being more popular and others being less popular. You might see mixes, and maybe possibly even quite fluid mixes of different uses taking place within the same space, which is something that you almost by definition can't tightly control. So that will be market driven as well. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think we have any more other questions coming in at the moment. I think and I think we've pretty well used up our 45-minute slot. I mean, I was going to say, what's next in the terms of what's the next radical what's the next radical change in the planning, but maybe that will be the subject for an entirely new presentation. So, perhaps one for the future. But I think on that note, Peter and Alex, many thanks indeed for coming on this morning and passing on your knowledge and expertise on the planning system. As I said, it's a departure from some of the BCO stuff that we've done, but I think it's a welcome departure and very well covered. So thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone who's listened this morning. As I said, look out for BCO events. For the Cambridge area, we will be back again in January in force, and I hope, as I said, we'll be kicking off with another of our virtual tours. But on that note, stay safe, everybody, and we'll be in touch again shortly. Okay, many thanks.